In 1867 Nebraska Territory, the townspeople of Millbrook thought they were cruel when they mocked James Crawford, the one-armed Civil War veteran they considered worthless, but they had no idea that Martha Sinclair, a woman hiding her own devastating secret, was about to prove that sometimes the most broken people possess the greatest power to heal. When two damaged souls discover that their scars might be the very thing that saves not just each other, but an entire community, will their love be strong enough to redefine what it truly means to be whole? The sound of children's laughter cut through the hot Nebraska air like broken glass, each giggle a reminder that James Crawford no longer belonged in their world. He pressed his back against the rough wooden wall of Miller's General Store, trying to make himself invisible, as three young boys pointed at his empty sleeve and whispered words that burned worse than the phantom pain in his missing arm. "Look at the soldier who came back broken," one boy said, loud enough for half the street to hear. "My pa says he's useless now. Can't even hold a rifle proper." James's jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. The summer of 1867 had turned Millbrook, Nebraska Territory into a furnace, but the heat that flooded his face had nothing to do with the weather. 6 months ago, he'd been Sergeant James Crawford, leading men through Confederate territory. Now he was just another piece of human wreckage that the war had spit back onto the frontier. The boys grew bolder, creeping closer like vultures circling wounded prey. The tallest one, maybe 10 years old with dirt-streaked cheeks, picked up a small stone from the dusty street. "Betty can't even catch this with one arm," the boy announced, drawing back his hand. "Billy Thompson, you put that rock down this instant!" The sharp voice cracked across the scene like a whip. A woman emerged from the store's shadowy interior, her brown dress simple but clean, her auburn hair pinned back with the efficiency of someone who had no time for vanity. She wasn't particularly tall, but something in her bearing made the boys step backward. "Your mother raised you better than to torment folks who've already paid their price." The boys scattered like startled chickens, their cruel game abandoned as quickly as it had begun. James found himself staring at the woman who defended him, studying her face for signs of the pity he'd grown to hate. Instead, he saw something unexpected in her green eyes, understanding that seemed to come from her own experience with being different. "I'm Martha Sinclair," she said, extending her hand toward him. As she did, James noticed a slight tremor in her fingers, barely visible but unmistakably there. "I run the boarding house past the church. You must be James Crawford. I heard you'd come home from the war." James hesitated before taking her hand with his good one. Her grip was firm despite the trembling, and she didn't look at his pinned sleeve or offer empty words about his sacrifice. "Yes, ma'am. Though I'm starting to wonder if home is the right word for a place where you don't fit anymore." "Fitting in is overrated," Martha replied with a small smile that transformed her whole face. "The most interesting people I know are the ones who learn to make their own place in the world." Before James could respond, the store's door flew open with enough force to rattle its hinges. Edgar Harmon stepped onto the wooden porch, his expensive suit and polished boots marking him as one of Millbrook's wealthier citizens. His eyes swept over the scene with obvious disapproval, lingering on James's empty sleeve before settling on Martha with barely concealed dislike. "Miss Sinclair," Harmon said, his voice carrying the tone of a man used to being obeyed. "I trust you're not out here collecting more strays for that establishment of yours. This town has enough problems without you encouraging every broken-down soul to settle here permanently." The words hit James like a physical blow, but Martha's reaction surprised him. Instead of shrinking back, she straightened her shoulders and met Harmon's gaze directly. "Mr. Harmon, I believe what this town needs is more compassion and fewer people who think a person's worth can be measured by their misfortunes. Compassion doesn't pay taxes or contribute to community progress," Harmon snapped. "Your boarding house attracts the sort of people who drag down property values and discourage respectable families from settling here. Mark my words, Miss Sinclair. Your little charity project will bring nothing but trouble to Millbrook." As Harmon strode away, his boots clicking against the wooden sidewalk, Martha turned back to James. The encounter had left a flush of anger in her cheeks, but her voice remained steady. "Don't let men like Edgar Harmon define what you're worth, Mr. Crawford. They measure everything by what they can see on the surface, never understanding that the deepest strengths often come from the deepest struggles." James studied her face, seeing past the polite words to something more personal underneath. Sounds like you speak from experience, Miss Sinclair. We all have our battles, Martha replied quietly. Some are just more visible than others. The question is whether we let those battles defeat us or teach us how to help others fight theirs. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as more townspeople emerged for their daily errands. James noticed how their eyes slid away from him, how conversations grew quieter when he passed, how mothers pulled their children closer as if his disability might somehow spread to them. But he also noticed how Martha walked beside him without shame, her presence somehow making the hostile stares less powerful. I should be getting back, James said finally, though he found himself reluctant to end this conversation, the first real one he'd had since returning to Millbrook. Thank you for standing up to those boys. And to Harmon. Standing up to bullies gets easier with practice, Martha said with a wry smile. Besides, I have a feeling you won't need anyone defending you much longer. Men who've survived what you have usually find their courage again, given time and the right circumstances. As she turned to leave, Martha paused and looked back at him. Mr. Crawford, I meant what I said about making our own place in the world. If you ever decide you're tired of letting other people tell you what you can and cannot do, you might consider stopping by the Sinclair Inn. I could use someone who understands that second chances are worth fighting for. James watched her walk away, noting how she moved with quiet determination despite whatever caused her hands to shake. For the first time since losing his arm, he felt something other than shame or anger stirring in his chest. It was a feeling he'd almost forgotten. Hope. The Sinclair Inn stood like a defiant promise at the edge of Millbrook's Main Street, its white-painted walls gleaming against the dusty backdrop of the Nebraska Territory. James approached the two-story building with careful steps, his heart hammering against his ribs in a rhythm that had nothing to do with the morning's heat. 3 days had passed since Martha Sinclair's unexpected invitation, and he'd spent every hour since then wrestling with the decision to accept it. The front porch welcomed visitors with rocking chairs that had seen better days but still held the promise of comfort. Flower boxes beneath the windows overflowed with prairie wildflowers, their bright colors a stark contrast to the brown and beige landscape that surrounded the town. Someone had taken great care to make this place feel like home, and James found himself wondering what kind of woman would invest so much hope in a world that seemed determined to crush it. Before he could knock, the front door swung open to reveal Martha Sinclair, her face lighting up with genuine pleasure at seeing him. She wore a simple blue dress with an apron tied around her waist, and her auburn hair caught the morning sunlight in a way that made James forget to breathe for a moment. Mr. Crawford, I was hoping you'd decide to visit. Please, come in. I was just about to serve breakfast, and there's always room for one more at our table. James followed her into the inn's main hallway, immediately struck by the warmth that seemed to radiate from every corner. The walls were painted a soft yellow that caught and held the light streaming through clean windows. Photographs of families and landscapes hung in simple frames, creating a gallery of memories that belonged to no one and everyone at the same time. The wooden floors showed their age, but gleamed with careful polishing, and the smell of fresh bread and coffee created an atmosphere that made James's empty stomach growl audibly. Don't mind the noise, Martha said with a laugh as voices drifted from what must be the dining room. Breakfast is the most social meal of the day here. Everyone has opinions about everything, and they're not shy about sharing them. As they approached the dining room, James caught fragments of animated conversation. An elderly man's voice rose above the others, speaking with the authority of someone who'd lived through enough history to have strong opinions about current events. A younger voice, hesitant but determined, struggled through what sounded like a reading lesson. Someone else laughed at a joke James couldn't quite catch, the sound warm and inclusive rather than mocking. Martha paused just outside the dining room doorway, her hand resting lightly on James's good arm. Before we go in, I should probably warn you that my residents aren't exactly what most people would consider normal. We're a collection of folks who found ourselves on the outside of polite society for one reason or another, if that makes you uncomfortable. Miss Sinclair, James interrupted gently, I haven't felt comfortable in polite society since I came home from the war. I think I'll fit right in with your outsiders. Her smile could have powered every lamp in the inn. In that case, let me introduce you to your new family. The dining room buzzed with activity around a long wooden table that had clearly been built to accommodate a crowd. James took in the scene with the tactical awareness that had kept him alive during the war, cataloging faces and details without appearing to stare. At the head of the table sat an elderly man with silver hair and hands gnarled by arthritis, but his eyes sparkled with intelligence as he gestured animatedly while making a point about railroad expansion. Across from him, a young boy of perhaps 12 struggled to sound out words from a newspaper, his face flushed with concentration and determination. A middle-aged woman with graying hair and kind eyes caught sight of Martha and James in the doorway. "Martha, dear, bring your guest over here. We've got fresh eggs from the chickens and biscuits that are still warm from the oven." "Everyone," Martha announced, her voice carrying easily across the comfortable chaos. "I'd like you to meet James Crawford. He's considering joining our little community here at the inn." The conversation didn't stop entirely, but it shifted to include the newcomer with practiced ease. The elderly man extended a hand across the table. "Daniel Jameson, formerly of the 5th Iowa Volunteer Infantry. I can tell from the way you carry yourself that you're military, son." "Which unit?" "7th Illinois Infantry, sir." "Sergeant Crawford." James found himself returning the firm handshake, surprised by the strength in the old man's arthritic fingers. "Good outfit, the 7th. I served alongside some of your boys at Shiloh. Damned fine soldiers, every one of them." Jameson's eyes flickered briefly to James's empty sleeve, but his expression held only respect, not pity. "War takes different things from different men, but it can't take away what you proved about yourself when it mattered most." Before James could respond, the young boy looked up from his newspaper with curious eyes. "Are you going to live here too, mister? I'm Timothy O'Brien, and I'm learning to read real good. Miss Martha says reading opens doors to places you never knew existed." "That's exactly right, Timothy," Martha said, settling into a chair and gesturing for James to take the empty seat beside her. "Mr. Crawford is thinking about helping me run the inn. He has skills we could certainly use around here." A woman James hadn't noticed before emerged from what must be the kitchen, carrying a platter of eggs that made his mouth water. She was perhaps 40, with the weathered hands of someone who'd worked hard all her life, but her smile was as warm as the food she served. "I'm Rosa Valdez," she said, setting the platter on the table. "I do most of the cooking here, and let me tell you, it's nice to have people who appreciate good food after going without for too long." As the meal progressed, James found himself drawn into conversations that ranged from the practical details of running a boarding house to spirited debates about territorial politics. Timothy struggled through another paragraph of the newspaper, earning encouraging nods from everyone at the table when he successfully navigated a particularly difficult word. Daniel Jameson shared stories about his garden behind the inn, describing plans for expanding it in the coming season. Rosa discussed the challenges of feeding a house full of people with varying appetites and dietary needs. Through it all, Martha orchestrated the conversation with subtle skill, drawing out the quieter voices and gently redirecting when discussions grew too heated. James noticed how her hands trembled slightly when she lifted her coffee cup, but no one else seemed to pay attention to it. Whatever condition caused the shaking, it was clearly something her residents had grown accustomed to and chose not to treat as a limitation. "Mr. Crawford," Martha said during a brief lull in the conversation, "would you like to see the rest of the inn? I could show you the room that might be yours, if you decide to stay." James nodded, suddenly aware that everyone at the table was watching him with friendly but evaluating eyes. These people had found something special here, something worth protecting, and they wanted to know if he would add to it or threaten it. The tour took them through the inn's public spaces first. A sitting room with comfortable chairs arranged for conversation, a small library with books that showed the wear of frequent reading, and a back porch that looked out over Daniel's garden and the prairie beyond. Everything was clean and well-maintained despite obvious age, creating an atmosphere of shabby dignity that appealed to James more than the fanciest hotel ever could. "The room I have in mind for you is on the 2nd floor," Martha said as they climbed the narrow staircase. "It faces east, so you get the morning sun, and it's large enough for both sleeping and working if you decide to help with the bookkeeping." The room she showed him was simple but welcoming, with a bed that looked actually comfortable, a desk positioned to catch the light from the window, and a wardrobe that would easily hold his few possessions. More importantly, it felt like a place where a man could rebuild his sense of purpose and dignity. The position I have in mind wouldn't just be about keeping books, Martha said, settling into the room's single chair while James examined the view from the window. I need someone who understands what it means to start over. Someone who can help other people believe that their past doesn't have to define their future. Based on what I saw the other day with those boys, and again with Edgar Harmon, I think you might be exactly the person I've been looking for. James turned from the window to study her face, seeing past the careful words to the vulnerability underneath. Miss Sinclair, can I ask you something directly? Of course. Why are you really doing this? Running a boarding house for people the rest of the town considers unwanted? Taking risks with men like Edgar Harmon who clearly have the power to make trouble for you? He paused, then decided to push further. And why are you taking a chance on a broken-down soldier who hasn't proven he can be useful to anyone? Martha was quiet for a long moment, her hands folded in her lap to still their trembling. When she spoke, her voice carried an honesty that hit James like a physical force. Because I know what it feels like to be seen as damaged goods, Mr. Crawford. I know what it's like to have people look at you and see only what's wrong, only what makes you different or difficult or inconvenient. I started this because I believe that everyone deserves a place where they can be valued for who they are, not judged for what they've lost or what makes them imperfect. She stood and moved to the window, looking out over the garden where Daniel Jameson was already at work despite the early hour. As for taking a chance on you specifically, I watched you stand up to Edgar Harmon the other day. I saw how you protected your dignity without losing your compassion. That tells me more about your character than any recommendation letter ever could. James joined her at the window, standing close enough to catch the faint scent of lavender soap and something uniquely her own. And what about the trembling in your hands? Is that part of why you understand what it means to be seen as damaged? Instead of being offended by his directness, Martha seemed relieved to have the subject brought into the open. I have a condition that the doctors in Omaha can't quite identify. Some days my hands shake so badly I can barely hold a pen. Other days I feel weak all over, like my own body has decided to work against me. It's getting worse, slowly but surely, and there's nothing anyone can do to stop it. The admission hung between them, heavy with implication. James understood now why she'd chosen to dedicate her life to helping others who society had written off. She was racing against time, trying to build something meaningful before her own body betrayed her completely. That's why you need help with the inn, he said quietly. Not just because business is growing, but because you're preparing for the day when you won't be able to manage everything yourself. Partly yes, but also because I believe that the work we're doing here is bigger than any one person. These people, Daniel with his arthritis, Timothy with his learning struggles, Rosa trying to start over after losing her husband, they all deserve someone who will fight for them when I no longer can. James looked around the room that could be his, then back at the woman who was offering him far more than just employment. She was offering him purpose, community, and the chance to matter in ways he'd never imagined possible. When would you need an answer? He asked. Martha's smile was small but brilliant. How about right now? Rosa's making her famous chicken and dumplings for dinner tonight, and Daniel's been wanting to show someone his prized tomatoes. Timothy could use help with his reading, and I have ledgers that need attention from someone with steady hands and a sharp mind. James extended his good hand toward her, and she took it without hesitation. Miss Sinclair, I believe you've just hired yourself a partner. Outside the window, Daniel Jameson looked up from his garden and waved at them with dirt-stained fingers and a grin that suggested he'd been expecting this outcome all along. The Nebraska Territory stretched endlessly beyond Millbrook, full of possibility for those brave enough to write their own definitions of home, purpose, and worth. The sound of Timothy O'Brien's triumphant shout echoed across the Sinclair Inn's garden as he successfully read an entire paragraph without stumbling over a single word. James looked up from the accounting ledger he'd been working on, a smile tugging at his lips as he watched the 12-year-old boy dance around Daniel Jameson's tomato plants with pure joy radiating from every step. Did you hear that, Mr. Crawford? Timothy called out, waving the newspaper like a victory flag. I read the whole story about the railroad coming through Kansas without missing one word. Miss Martha says I'm getting so good that soon I'll be able to help you with the bookkeeping. 3 weeks had passed, since James had moved into the inn, and the transformation in his daily life felt almost magical. Where mornings used to stretch endlessly with nothing but regret and phantom pain to fill them, now each day brought new challenges and small victories. The ledger books that had once seemed impossible to manage with one hand now felt natural under his careful attention, and the residents had become less like strangers and more like the family he'd thought he'd lost forever. Martha emerged from the kitchen carrying a pitcher of fresh lemonade, her movements graceful despite the trembling that had grown slightly more noticeable over the past week. She'd mentioned that the summer heat seemed to make her condition worse, but she refused to let it slow down her determination to keep the inn running smoothly. James had learned to watch for the subtle signs that indicated when she needed help, offering assistance in ways that preserved her dignity while ensuring nothing important got overlooked. Timothy's reading has improved so much that I'm thinking of asking him to help with correspondence, Martha said, settling into the chair beside James on the back porch. We get letters from families asking about rooms, and having him practice by writing responses would benefit everyone. Daniel Jameson straightened up from where he'd been tending his vegetables, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his sleeve. Despite his arthritis, the old soldier had managed to coax an impressive garden from the Nebraska soil, providing fresh produce that kept Rosa's meals interesting and reduced the inn's expenses. That boy's got more determination than most grown men I've known, he said with obvious pride. Reminds me of young recruits who refused to give up, even when everything seemed hopeless. The peaceful afternoon was interrupted by the sound of horses approaching at speed. James instinctively tensed, his military training making him alert to anything that broke normal patterns. Through the garden's fence, he could see a cloud of dust moving toward the inn, suggesting multiple riders coming fast rather than the leisurely pace of typical visitors. Expecting anyone? James asked Martha quietly, noticing how her hands had begun shaking more violently at the sound of approaching trouble. No, and visitors usually come to the front door, not around back like this. Martha's voice carried worry that she tried to hide from Timothy, but James could hear the fear underneath her calm words. The riders materialized through the dust cloud as they rounded the inn's corner. Edgar Harmon, leading 3 men James didn't recognize, all mounted on horses that had clearly been pushed hard. Harmon's face was flushed with anger and something that looked suspiciously like triumph, while his companions carried themselves with the rigid posture of men who followed orders without asking questions. Miss Sinclair, Harmon called out as he dismounted, his boots hitting the ground with aggressive force. I need to speak with you immediately about some very serious matters that have come to my attention. James stood slowly, positioning himself slightly in front of Martha without making the movement obvious. His missing arm put him at a disadvantage in any physical confrontation, but his remaining hand was steady and his mind sharp enough to assess threats quickly. The 3 men with Harmon looked like the kind of hired muscle that wealthy businessmen sometimes employed when they needed problems solved through intimidation rather than negotiation. Mr. Harmon, Martha replied, rising from her chair with dignity intact despite the obvious tremor in her voice. If you have business to discuss, you're welcome to call during normal hours and make an appointment like any civilized person. Civilly said? Harmon's laugh was harsh and bitter. There's nothing civilized about what you're doing here, woman. I've been investigating your little establishment, and what I've discovered is going to shut you down permanently. Timothy had stopped his celebration and moved closer to Daniel, the boy's instincts telling him that the grown-ups were about to engage in the kind of serious conversation that often resulted in changes he wouldn't like. Rosa appeared in the kitchen doorway, her hands wrapped around a rolling pin that could serve as a weapon if the situation deteriorated beyond words. What exactly do you think you've discovered? James asked, his voice carrying the authority he'd learned to project during his military service. Because from where I stand, Miss Sinclair runs an honest business that provides valuable services to this community. One of Harmon's companions, a thin man with cold eyes and quick hands, shifted his position to get a better angle on James. The movement was subtle but unmistakable to anyone who'd spent time in dangerous situations. These men hadn't come just to talk. Sergeant Crawford, isn't it? Harmon's voice dripped with false politeness. I've been asking questions about you too. Turns out there are some interesting gaps in your military record. Some questions about what really happened during your last battle that might surprise the good people of Millbrook. The words hit James like a physical blow, bringing back memories he'd worked hard to bury. The battle where he'd lost his arm had been chaotic and brutal, with decisions made in seconds that haunted him during sleepless nights. There had been an investigation afterward, questions about orders given and men lost, but nothing that had resulted in formal charges. Still, the shadow of doubt had followed him home, adding another layer to his sense of worthlessness. Martha stepped forward, her chin raised in defiance despite the fear James could see in her eyes. "Whatever you think you know about Mr. Crawford's service record has nothing to do with the inn or our business here. Doesn't it?" Harmon's smile was predatory. "I wonder what your residents would think if they knew they were living under the same roof as a man whose own commanding officers questioned his judgment. Or what the territorial authorities might think about a boarding house run by a woman whose medical condition makes her unfit to manage such an establishment." Daniel Jameson had been listening to the exchange with growing anger, his arthritic hands clenched into fists despite the pain it must have caused. "Edgar Harmon, you're talking about two of the finest people I've ever had the privilege to know. Whatever lies you think you've dug up won't change the fact that they've created something good here." "Lies?" Harmon turned his attention to the old man with obvious contempt. "I have documented evidence that Sergeant Crawford made decisions during his final engagement that resulted in unnecessary casualties. Men died because of his poor judgment, and now he's here pretending to be some kind of hero." The accusation hung in the air like poison, threatening to destroy everything James had worked to rebuild over the past 3 weeks. He could feel the familiar shame rising in his chest, the voice that whispered he truly was damaged goods who brought nothing but trouble to anyone foolish enough to trust him. But then Martha's hand slipped into his, her trembling fingers intertwining with his steady ones in a gesture of complete faith. "Mr. Harmon," she said quietly, "I don't care what happened during the war. I care about the man James Crawford has proven himself to be since he's been here. He's shown more courage, compassion, and integrity in 3 weeks than you've displayed in all the years I've known you." Timothy looked back and forth between the adults, his young face scrunched with confusion and growing anger. "Mr. Crawford helped me learn to read better," he said loudly, his voice cracking with emotion. "He's nice to everyone and he works really hard and he makes Miss Martha smile. I don't care what some stupid old battle was like." Rosa stepped fully onto the porch, her rolling pin held in a way that suggested she knew how to use it for more than baking. "In my country, we have a saying," she announced in her accented English. "A man's worth is measured by how he treats those who can do nothing for him. James Crawford has earned our respect through his actions, not his past." Harmon's face darkened with frustration, as his attempt at intimidation met unified resistance. "You people are all living in a fantasy if you think this pathetic collection of misfits can stand against the forces of progress and proper society. The railroad is coming through this area whether you like it or not, and when it does, there won't be room for establishments that cater to society's unwanted elements." "The railroad?" Martha's voice sharpened with new understanding. "This is about forcing us to sell our land, isn't it? All this talk about James's war record and my medical condition, you're just looking for excuses to shut us down because we're in the way of your development plans." James felt pieces clicking into place in his mind, his strategic training helping him see the larger pattern behind Harmon's harassment. "How much are they paying you, Harmon?" "The railroad company must be offering significant compensation for anyone who can clear troublesome property owners out of their path." The thin man with cold eyes took another step forward, his hand moving toward something concealed beneath his jacket. "Maybe we should stop talking and start convincing these folks to be more reasonable about their situation." But Daniel Jameson had noticed the man's movement too, and despite his arthritis, the old soldier still possessed sharp instincts. "I wouldn't reach for whatever you've got hidden under there, son," he said calmly, producing a well-maintained pistol from somewhere within his gardening clothes. "Some of us old veterans still remember how to handle ourselves when threatened." The situation balanced on a knife's edge, with violence threatening to erupt despite everyone's desire to resolve things peacefully. Timothy pressed closer to Rosa, while Martha's hand tightened on James's fingers. The afternoon heat seemed to intensify the tension, making every breath feel charged with dangerous possibility. "This isn't over," Harmon said finally, his voice low and filled with promise. "You people think you can stand against progress and proper authority, but you're wrong. I'll find ways to shut down this pathetic operation that you won't see coming until it's too late." As the men remounted and rode away, Leaving behind a cloud of dust and unspoken threats, James realized that everything had changed. The peaceful refuge they'd been building was now under direct attack, and the battle lines had been clearly drawn. Whatever happened next would determine not just the fate of the Sinclair Inn, but the future of everyone who had found hope within its walls. Martha leaned against him, her trembling more pronounced, now that the immediate danger had passed. "James, I'm sorry he brought up your war record. Whatever happened during that battle, it doesn't change how I feel about the man you are now." James looked around at the faces of people who had chosen to stand with him, despite the accusations and threats. For the first time since losing his arm, he felt something stronger than shame or self-doubt. He felt the fierce protectiveness of a man who had found something worth fighting for. "No," he said quietly, "I'm the one who should apologize. By coming here, I've brought danger to all of you, but I promise you this. Whatever Edgar Harmon has planned, we'll face it together. And we'll prove that some things are more important than railroad profits and social respectability." The sun was beginning to set over the Nebraska Territory, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to promise both beauty and conflict in the days ahead. "Fire! Fire at the inn!" The desperate cry shattered the pre-dawn quiet of Millbrook as young Timothy O'Brien raced through the streets, his bare feet slapping against the wooden sidewalks while his voice cracked with terror and exhaustion. Behind him, orange flames licked hungrily at the sky, casting dancing shadows that made the entire world seem to flicker between reality and nightmare. James Crawford was already awake when Timothy's shouts reached the inn, his soldier's instincts having roused him at the first scent of smoke drifting through his window. He rolled from his bed with practiced efficiency, his single arm working to pull on clothes while his mind rapidly assessed the situation. The fire was real, it was close, and from the sound of Timothy's panic, people were in immediate danger. Martha's voice called out from somewhere in the building's lower level, sharp with authority despite the obvious fear underneath. "Everyone to the back garden! Leave everything and get out now!" Her words were followed by the sound of doors slamming open as the inn's residents responded to the emergency, with the discipline that came from trusting their leader completely. James burst from his room to find the hallway already thick with smoke, the wooden walls and floors providing eager fuel for flames that had apparently started somewhere near the kitchen. Through the haze, he could see Daniel Jameson helping Rosa Valdez navigate the narrow staircase, the old soldier's arthritis forgotten in the face of immediate crisis. Other residents stumbled through the choking air, clutching whatever possessions they'd managed to grab in their rush to escape. "Where's Martha?" James shouted over the crackling roar that was growing louder by the second. The heat was becoming intense enough to make breathing difficult, and he could see that parts of the building's structure were already compromised. "Still inside." Timothy appeared at James's side, his young face streaked with soot and tears. "She went back for the strongbox with all the important papers. I tried to stop her, but she said we needed those documents to prove we own the place." James felt his blood turn to ice. The strongbox was kept in Martha's private office on the ground floor, directly in the path of what appeared to be the fire's main advance. By now, that entire section of the building would be engulfed in flames hot enough to kill anyone caught inside. But without those ownership papers, Harmon and his railroad associates would have legal grounds to claim the land regardless of what survived the fire. "Get everyone to safety in the garden," James ordered Timothy, his voice carrying the authority of his military rank. "Make sure Daniel does a head count, and that nobody tries to come back inside for any reason." Before Timothy could protest, James was moving toward the stairs, using his intimate knowledge of the inn's layout to navigate through smoke so thick it felt like trying to breathe underwater. The heat grew more intense with each step downward, and he could hear the ominous groaning of wooden beams being stressed beyond their limits by the fire's assault. The ground floor was a vision of hell, with flames consuming everything that would burn and smoke, creating a fog so dense that James had to feel his way along the walls. He could hear Martha's voice somewhere ahead, coughing violently but still determined to complete her mission. The sound guided him through the maze of hallways toward her office, where the most important battle of the night was being fought. He found her on her hands and knees beside her desk, the strongbox clutched against her chest, while flames licked at the walls around her. Her dress was singed in several places, and her face was streaked with soot, but her eyes blazed with determination that matched the fire surrounding them. The trembling in her hands had been replaced by the steady grip of someone fighting for everything that mattered. "Martha!" James dropped to his knees beside her, wrapping his good arm around her shoulders. We have to get out of here now. The whole building is about to collapse. The papers, she gasped, her voice barely audible over the fire's roar. Without these documents, Harmon can claim we never had legal ownership. Everything we've built will be lost, and everyone who depends on this place will have nowhere to go. James understood the choice she was facing, but he also knew that no piece of paper was worth dying for. He tried to take the strongbox from her, but she held it with desperate strength, her condition forgotten in the face of protecting her life's work. Around them, the fire continued its advance, cutting off their original escape route and forcing them to find another way out. This way, James said, remembering a window in the office that opened onto the garden. The glass was already cracked from the heat, and he used his elbow to shatter it completely, creating an opening large enough for them to climb through. Hot air rushed past them toward the broken window, drawing the flames in their direction with terrifying speed. Martha went first, clutching the strongbox while James helped her navigate the window frame. The trembling had returned to her hands with a vengeance, made worse by the stress and smoke inhalation, but she managed to drop safely to the ground outside. James followed immediately after, landing hard on his shoulder but rolling away from the building as flames began pouring through the window they'd just escaped. The scene in the garden was controlled chaos, with in-residents organized into a bucket brigade that was attempting to slow the fire's spread to nearby buildings. Daniel Jameson had taken charge of the effort despite his arthritis, directing younger men in forming efficient lines between the well and the burning structure. Rosa was treating minor burns and smoke inhalation, while Timothy ran messages between different groups with the energy that only desperate children possessed. Is everyone accounted for? Martha asked as soon as she could speak clearly, her voice hoarse from smoke but still focused on her responsibilities to others. Everyone's safe, Daniel reported, pausing in his bucket, passing duties to check on her condition. But I'm afraid the inn itself is a total loss. The fire spread too far and too fast for us to save much of the structure. As if to emphasize his words, a section of the roof collapsed with a thunderous crash, sending sparks and burning debris high into the night sky. The building that had sheltered so many lost souls was being consumed by flames that showed no mercy for the love and care that had gone into creating it. James helped Martha to a safe distance where she could sit and catch her breath while still maintaining visual contact with the disaster. The strongbox remained clutched in her arms like a lifeline, and he could see tears cutting tracks through the soot on her cheeks as she watched her life's work being destroyed. Martha, I'm so sorry, he said quietly, settling beside her on the ground. If I hadn't come here, if Harmon hadn't been trying to get at me through the inn, none of this would have happened. She turned to look at him with eyes that held pain but no blame. James Crawford, don't you dare apologize for being the best thing that's happened to this place since I opened it. This fire wasn't caused by you being here, it was caused by evil men who couldn't stand the idea of people like us proving them wrong about what we're worth. Timothy approached them, carrying a bucket of water that was mostly empty by the time he arrived, his young face showing exhaustion and confusion about what would happen next. Miss Martha, where are we all going to live now? I don't have anywhere else to go, and neither do most of the others. Before Martha could answer, the sound of multiple horses approaching at speed cut through the night air. James tensed, expecting to see Harmon and his associates arriving to gloat over their successful destruction of the inn. Instead, the riders who emerged from the darkness were townspeople, families from Millbrook carrying blankets, food, and offers of temporary shelter. Dr. Morrison was among the first to reach them, his medical bag in hand as he began checking residents for injuries. We saw the fire from town and came as quickly as we could, he explained while examining a cut on Rosa's arm. Mrs. Henderson has opened her house to anyone who needs a place to stay tonight, and the church is being prepared as temporary housing for as long as necessary. James watched in amazement as person after person stepped forward with concrete offers of help. The same people who had shunned him and whispered about Martha's collection of misfits were now treating the inn's residents like neighbors in need rather than unwanted burdens. The tragedy that was meant to destroy their community was instead revealing the bonds that connected them to the larger world around them. How did you all know to come? Martha asked, her voice filled with wonder at the unexpected support. Young Timothy here woke up half the town with his shouting, Mrs. Henderson replied, her earlier disapproval replaced by genuine concern. Once we understood what was happening, it didn't take long for folks to realize that losing the inn would hurt all of us. You've been taking care of people who needed help, and now it's our turn to take care of you. As dawn broke over the Nebraska territory, the smoking ruins of the Sinclair Inn stood as testimony to both destruction and resilience. The building was gone, but the community it had sheltered remained intact, supported now by a broader network of people who had discovered that their fates were more intertwined than they'd previously understood. Edgar Harmon appeared as the sun climbed higher, arriving with official-looking documents and a satisfied expression that faded quickly when he saw the unified response to the disaster. The strongbox that Martha had risked her life to save sat safely beside her, its contents proving their legal ownership of the land, despite his attempts to steal it through intimidation and arson. "This changes nothing," Harmon declared, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "The railroad still needs this land, and a burned-out boarding house doesn't change the territorial development plans." James stood slowly, his good hand resting protectively on Martha's shoulder, while his eyes met Harmon's with steady determination. "Actually, Mr. Harmon, this changes everything. Last night, this community showed what it's really made of, and I don't think you're going to find it as easy to divide us as you thought." The battle for the inn's future was far from over, but the ground had shifted in ways that neither side had anticipated. In trying to destroy what Martha and James had built together, their enemies had instead revealed the strength that comes from people choosing to stand together against those who would tear them down. The courtroom in Omaha buzzed with tension as thick as summer honey, every whispered conversation and shuffling footstep echoing off the high wooden walls like gunshots in the morning stillness. James Crawford adjusted his position in the hard chair, his empty sleeve carefully pinned to avoid drawing attention, while his eyes swept across the crowd of faces that would determine the fate of everything he and Martha had fought to build. 3 weeks had passed since the fire, and the legal battle that followed had drawn attention from across the Nebraska territory. What had started as a simple property dispute had grown into something much larger, a test of whether communities could protect themselves against powerful interests that viewed people as obstacles to be removed rather than neighbors to be respected. The territorial judge, a stern man named William Hayes, commanded the proceedings with the gravity befitting such an important case. Martha sat beside James, her hands folded carefully in her lap to hide their trembling, but her spine straight with determination that had only grown stronger since losing the inn. The strongbox that she'd risked her life to save now sat as evidence before the judge, its contents spread across the plaintiff's table like a paper fortress defending their rights. Every deed, every receipt, every carefully documented transaction that proved their legitimate ownership of the land where the Sinclair Inn had stood. Edgar Harmon occupied the defendant's table with his expensive lawyer, a thin man from Kansas City whose sharp suit and sharper tongue had already proven formidable during the preliminary hearings. Behind them sat representatives from the railroad company, their faces showing the confident patience of people who believed money could solve any legal obstacle. They'd underestimated the strength of the opposition they now faced. "Your Honor," the railroad's lawyer began, rising with practiced grace, "this case represents a simple matter of territorial development versus personal sentiment. While we sympathize with the plaintiff's attachment to their property, the greater good of Nebraska territory requires that essential transportation infrastructure take precedence over individual preferences." Judge Hayes studied the man with eyes that revealed nothing about his thoughts. "Mr. Peterson, this court is not concerned with your client's development preferences. We are here to determine whether the defendants acted within legal boundaries when they attempted to force the sale of legitimately owned property through intimidation and, allegedly, arson." The word arson sent a ripple through the courtroom audience, many of whom had traveled from Millbrook to support Martha and James. Timothy O'Brien sat in the front row between Daniel Jameson and Rosa Valdez, his young face serious with the weight of adult concerns he was only beginning to understand. Dr. Morrison had closed his practice for the day to attend, along with Mrs. Henderson and several other townspeople whose presence testified to the community's support that had emerged from the ashes of the destroyed inn. "We call our first witness," announced Martha's lawyer, a stocky man named Robert Sullivan, who had agreed to take the case after hearing about the fire. Mrs. Clara Henderson of Millbrook. Mrs. Henderson rose from her seat with obvious nervousness, smoothing her best dress as she made her way to the witness stand. James remembered how she'd whispered about Martha's strays just weeks earlier, but the fire had changed something fundamental in how she viewed the inn and its residents. Her testimony about seeing suspicious riders near the property on the night of the fire carried the weight of reluctant honesty that made it impossible to dismiss. Mrs. Henderson, Sullivan continued, did you recognize any of the men you saw that evening? I'm not certain about faces in the dark, she replied carefully, but I did recognize one of the horses. It belonged to Cal Morrison, not the doctor, but the other Morrison who sometimes does work for Mr. Clausum, Harmon, when he needs things done quietly. The implication hung in the courtroom air like smoke from the destroyed building. Harmon's face remained carefully neutral, but James noticed a slight tightening around his eyes that suggested the testimony was hitting closer to home than he'd expected. The railroad lawyer made notes on his legal pad with sharp, angry strokes that betrayed his frustration with this unexpected development. Timothy was called next. His small figure dwarfed by the witness stand, but his voice clear and steady as he described the events of that terrible night. James felt proud watching the boy who'd struggled so hard with reading now, speaking confidently before a room full of adults about things no child should have to witness. Mr. O'Brien, Sullivan said gently, can you tell the court what you observed about the fire's starting point? Timothy's face scrunched with concentration as he recalled details that had been burned into his memory. It started near the kitchen, but not inside where it should if it was an accident. It was outside the window, like somebody had piled stuff there and lit it on purpose. Miss Rosa always keeps that area clean because she doesn't want rats, so there wasn't supposed to be anything there that could catch fire by itself. The boy's observation carried more weight than many adult testimonies because of its innocent clarity. Children often notice details that adults overlooked, and Timothy's account painted a picture of deliberate arson that would be difficult for the defense to explain away through accident or coincidence. Daniel Jameson followed Timothy to the stand, his arthritic hands gripping the rail as he swore to tell the truth. The old soldier's military bearing commanded respect from everyone in the courtroom, including Judge Hayes, who leaned forward slightly as Daniel began describing the pattern of harassment that had preceded the fire. Your Honor, I've seen intimidation tactics used against civilian populations during wartime, Daniel said, his voice carrying the authority of hard-won experience. What Mr. Harmon and his associates did to Miss Sinclair and her residents follows the same pattern. Psychological pressure designed to break people's will to resist. The fire was just the final step in a campaign that had been building for weeks. The railroad lawyer objected to Daniel's characterization, but Judge Hayes allowed the testimony to stand, noting that the witness's military experience qualified him to recognize organized intimidation when he saw it. James watched Harmon's confident demeanor begin to crack as witness after witness painted a picture of systematic harassment rather than legitimate business negotiations. Rosa Valdez took the stand next, her accented English carrying emotional weight as she described the sense of safety and belonging that the inn had provided for people who'd had nowhere else to turn. Her tears were genuine as she spoke about watching their home burn, but her anger was equally real when she described the deliberate cruelty of destroying a place that had served people whose society had already rejected once. In my country, Rosa said, her voice growing stronger as she continued, we have seen what happens when powerful men decide that certain people do not deserve to exist in peace. The fire at the inn was not just about taking our land. It was about telling us that we have no right to build something good together. When Martha was finally called to testify, the courtroom fell completely silent. She moved to the witness stand with careful dignity, her condition making each step deliberate but her determination evident in every line of her posture. James felt his heart clench as he watched her prepare to expose her private struggles to public scrutiny in order to defend their shared dream. Miss Sinclair, Sullivan began, can you describe for the court what the Sinclair Inn meant to the people who lived there? Martha's voice was quiet but clear as she spoke about creating a place where people could rebuild their lives without shame or judgment. She described Timothy's progress with reading, Daniel's contribution through his garden, Rosa's skills in the kitchen, and James's transformation from broken soldier to essential partner in running the establishment. Her words painted a picture of community that transcended the simple business transaction the railroad wanted the court to see. The inn was never just about providing rooms and meals, Martha concluded. It was about proving that people's worth isn't determined by what they've lost or what makes them different. We were building something that showed everyone, including ourselves, that second chances can create strength rather than weakness. The railroad lawyer's cross-examination was aggressive but ineffective. He tried to portray Martha as an unstable woman whose medical condition made her unfit to run a business, but his attacks only highlighted the courage it had taken for her to build something meaningful while fighting her own physical battles. He attempted to paint the inn's residents as society's unwanted burdens, but the testimony had already established their contributions to both the inn and the broader community. "Miss Sinclair," the lawyer said with obvious frustration, "isn't it true that your establishment attracted exactly the sort of people that decent communities prefer to avoid: disabled veterans, uneducated immigrants, elderly individuals with no family support?" Martha's response carried quiet fire that filled the courtroom with electricity. "Mr. Peterson, my establishment attracted people who needed a chance to prove their worth to a world that had already decided they had none. The fact that they succeeded in doing exactly that suggests the problem wasn't with them. It was with a society too narrow-minded to recognize the value that had been there all along." Judge Hayes called a recess as the afternoon wore on, and James stepped outside with Martha to get some fresh air away from the courtroom's oppressive atmosphere. The streets of Omaha bustled with normal activity, people going about their daily business while unaware that the fate of an entire community was being decided just blocks away. "How do you think we're doing?" Martha asked, settling on a bench outside the courthouse while her hands trembled with exhaustion from the stress of testifying. James sat beside her, close enough to offer support without crowding. "I think we're winning the battle over facts, but I'm not sure that's the same as winning the war. Harmon's lawyer is going to argue that individual rights have to yield to territorial development, and there are judges who agree with that philosophy. And if we lose, then we start over somewhere else," James said firmly. "The inn was just a building, Martha. What made it special was the people inside it and the community we created together. That can't be destroyed by fire or legal decisions." Martha smiled for the first time all day, reaching over to take his hand with fingers that steadied at his touch. "Have I mentioned lately that hiring you was the best decision I ever made?" "Actually," James replied with a grin that felt good after the day's tension, "I seem to remember that you were the one doing the hiring. I was just the lucky man who was smart enough to say yes." As they prepared to return for the afternoon session, neither of them noticed Edgar Harmon watching from across the street, his expression suggesting that he had one more card to play before the legal battle reached its conclusion. "I have new evidence that will change everything about this case," Edgar Harmon announced as he strode into the courtroom with documents clutched in his fist like weapons ready for deployment. The afternoon session had barely begun when Harmon's lawyer requested permission to present additional materials that had supposedly just come to light, and Judge Hayes had reluctantly agreed to hear what they had to offer. James felt a chill of dread settle in his stomach as he watched Harmon's confident swagger. The man carried himself like someone who'd finally found the ammunition needed to destroy his enemies completely, and the papers in his hand seemed to pulse with dangerous potential. Whatever information those documents contained, it was significant enough to make Harmon believe he could overturn all the morning's testimony in a single devastating blow. Martha's hand found James's beneath the courtroom table, her trembling fingers seeking reassurance that he wasn't sure he could provide. They'd built their case on truth and community support, but legal battles weren't always won by the side with justice on their side. Sometimes they were won by whoever could afford to dig deeper into their opponent's private lives and find secrets that could be weaponized in public forums. "Your Honor," Harmon's lawyer said, his earlier frustration replaced by renewed confidence, "we have obtained military records that cast serious doubt on Mr. Crawford's character and, by extension, on the judgment of anyone who would choose him as a business partner. These documents reveal details about his final battle that were previously sealed by military authorities." The words hit James like artillery fire, bringing back memories of the worst day of his life with vivid clarity that made breathing difficult. The battle where he'd lost his arm had also cost the lives of 3 men under his command. and the investigation that followed had left questions about his decisions that he'd never been able to fully answer. He'd thought those records were permanently sealed, but apparently Harmon had connections that reached deeper into military bureaucracy than anyone had anticipated. Judge Hayes examined the documents with careful attention while the courtroom waited in tense silence. James could feel eyes turning toward him with curiosity and judgment. The same hostile attention he'd endured when first returning to Millbrook, multiplied by the formal setting and legal stakes. His missing arm suddenly felt like a badge of shame rather than evidence of sacrifice, and the familiar voice of self-doubt began whispering that maybe he really was the damaged goods that polite society preferred to discard. "Mr. Crawford," Judge Hayes said finally, "these records indicate that during your final engagement, you disobeyed direct orders from your commanding officer and led your men into a position that resulted in casualties. The investigation concluded that while your actions didn't constitute formal insubordination, they showed poor judgment that contributed to unnecessary deaths. How do you respond to these allegations?" The question hung in the courtroom air like an executioner's blade waiting to fall. James could see Martha beside him, her face pale but her eyes blazing with fierce loyalty that made his chest tight with emotion. Behind them, the people of Millbrook waited to hear how their champion would defend himself against accusations that struck at the heart of military honor and personal character. James rose slowly, his legs unsteady but his voice finding strength as he faced the judge directly. "Your Honor, everything in those documents is factually accurate. I did disobey orders during that battle, and men died as a result of my decision. I've carried the weight of those deaths every day since, and I'll carry it for the rest of my life." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom as people processed his admission of guilt, but James continued speaking before anyone could interrupt. "What those documents don't explain is why I made that choice. My commanding officer ordered our unit to abandon wounded soldiers who were trapped behind enemy lines. He said they were already lost, and that risking more men to retrieve them would be strategically foolish." Martha's hand tightened on his as she understood where his story was leading. Timothy O'Brien leaned forward in his seat, his young face intense with concentration as he followed the moral complexity of adult decisions that carried life and death consequences. Even Harmon seemed to sense that his victory might not be as complete as he'd anticipated. "I chose to disobey that order because I couldn't live with abandoning men who had followed me into battle," James continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "We managed to rescue 4 wounded soldiers, but we lost 3 others in the process. The investigation concluded that my decision was emotionally driven rather than tactically sound, and they were probably right about that." Judge Hayes studied James with new interest, recognizing the difference between a man making excuses and one taking responsibility for difficult choices. "And how does this military incident relate to your current situation, Mr. Crawford?" "It relates because it shows exactly who I am, Your Honor. I'm someone who believes that you don't abandon people just because helping them involves risk or sacrifice. That's why I was drawn to Miss Sinclair's inn, and why I was willing to stand up to men like Mr. Harmon when they tried to intimidate people who couldn't defend themselves." The courtroom had grown completely silent as James's words sank in. What Harmon had intended as character assassination was being transformed into character revelation, showing not weakness but the kind of moral courage that led someone to choose what was right over what was safe or expedient. Martha stood beside him, her medical condition forgotten, in the face of defending the man who had become essential to everything good in her life. "Your Honor, if I may speak on Mr. Crawford's behalf." Judge Hayes nodded permission, and Martha's voice rang clear across the hushed courtroom. "The military records that Mr. Harmon has presented prove exactly why James Crawford was the right person to help me run the Sinclair Inn. They show a man who refuses to abandon people in need, even when doing so costs him personally. That's not a character flaw. That's the foundation of true leadership." Timothy O'Brien suddenly stood up in the gallery, his young voice cutting through the adult proceedings with startling clarity. "Judge Hayes, sir. Mr. Crawford helped me learn to read when everyone else said I was too stupid to bother with. He didn't abandon me either, even though helping me was extra work that nobody was paying him for." Before anyone could stop him, Daniel Jameson was on his feet as well. "Your Honor, I served under officers who made all their decisions based on regulations and career advancement. Sergeant Crawford is the kind of leader who makes decisions based on what's right, and any man would be honored to follow him into battle. Rosa Valdez joined the standing group, her accented voice carrying across the courtroom with passionate conviction. In my country, we know the difference between men who protect themselves and men who protect others. James Crawford is a protector, and that's why we trusted him with our safety at the inn. One by one, the people of Millbrook rose to their feet in a spontaneous show of support that transformed the courtroom into something resembling a community meeting rather than a legal proceeding. Mrs. Henderson, Dr. Morrison, and dozens of others stood in silent testimony to the character of a man they'd initially mistrusted but had come to respect through his actions rather than his words. Judge Hayes allowed the demonstration to continue for several moments before calling for order, but his expression suggested that the community response had made a deeper impression than any legal argument could have achieved. Harmon's face had grown increasingly desperate as his character assassination backfired, turning his target into a hero rather than a villain. Mr. Harmon, Judge Hayes said finally, it appears that your evidence has succeeded in demonstrating Mr. Crawford's character, though perhaps not in the way you intended. The court finds that his military record shows a pattern of moral courage rather than poor judgment, and that his presence at the Sinclair Inn represents community stability rather than a threat to public order. The railroad lawyer made one final attempt to salvage his case by arguing that individual character was irrelevant to territorial development needs, but his words fell on ears that had already heard enough. Judge Hayes studied the assembled crowd of ordinary people who had chosen to support their neighbors against powerful interests, and something in his expression suggested that he understood the larger implications of the case before him. This court will recess until tomorrow morning for final arguments, Judge Hayes announced. But I want to make clear that this case has demonstrated something important about the character of communities and the individuals who comprise them. Legal decisions should be based on law rather than sentiment, but justice requires us to consider the human consequences of our rulings. As the courtroom began to empty, James found himself surrounded by people who wanted to shake his hand and express their support. The shame that had haunted him since returning from the war was being replaced by something he'd never expected to feel again: the respect of his community and the knowledge that his actions mattered to people beyond himself. Martha waited until the crowd had thinned before approaching him, her eyes bright with tears that held pride rather than sorrow. James Crawford, you are the bravest man I've ever known. Not because you fought in the war, but because you fought every day since to become someone worthy of the second chance you've been given. Outside the courthouse, the people of Millbrook gathered in small groups to discuss the day's revelations and plan for whatever tomorrow might bring. The legal battle wasn't over, but something fundamental had shifted in the community's understanding of itself and the values it wanted to defend. Win or lose, they had discovered that some things were worth fighting for, and some people were worth standing with regardless of the personal cost. Edgar Harmon emerged from the courthouse alone, his confident swagger replaced by the hunched posture of a man who had underestimated his opponents and overestimated his own power. The railroad money that had seemed like such an advantage now felt like a burden that connected him to interests that cared nothing for the community he actually had to live in. For the first time since the conflict began, he looked like a man who was beginning to understand that victory might come at a price he wasn't prepared to pay. The Nebraska Territory stretched endlessly beyond Omaha, full of possibility for those brave enough to define progress in terms of human dignity rather than corporate profit. Tomorrow would bring the final chapter of their legal battle, but tonight belonged to a community that had discovered its own strength through the courage to stand together against those who would tear them apart. The court finds in favor of the plaintiffs, Judge Hayes announced, his words cutting through the morning silence like thunder rolling across the Nebraska plains. The courtroom erupted in celebration as Martha Sinclair collapsed into James Crawford's embrace, tears streaming down her face, while Timothy O'Brien whooped with joy from the gallery and Daniel Jameson pumped his arthritic fist in triumph. But James noticed something that chilled his blood even as victory surrounded them. Edgar Harmon's face showed no surprise, no defeat, only the cold satisfaction of a man whose real plan was just beginning. The railroad representative beside him whispered something urgent in his ear before slipping out the back door with obvious haste, and James realized that winning in court might only be the first battle in a war that was far from over. Judge Hayes continued reading his decision, explaining that the evidence of arson and intimidation made it clear that the defendants had acted outside legal boundaries in their attempts to acquire the Sinclair Inn property. The land would remain in Martha's possession, with additional damages awarded for the destroyed building and lost income. It was everything they'd hoped for, yet James couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. "Martha," he whispered urgently as the celebration continued around them, "we need to get back to Millbrook immediately. Look at Harmon's face. He's not acting like a man who just lost everything." Martha pulled back to study James's expression, seeing the military alertness that had kept him alive during countless dangerous situations. Her own intuition, sharpened by months of dealing with Harmon's threats, began signaling alarm as she noticed details that pure joy had initially masked. The way Harmon's lawyer was gathering papers with efficient speed rather than disappointed slowness. The absence of the railroad's main representative, who should have been devastated by the court's ruling. "What do you think they're planning?" Martha asked quietly, her celebration fading as strategic thinking took over. "I don't know, but men like Harmon don't put all their hopes in legal proceedings. They have backup plans, and those plans usually involve methods that courts can't control." James helped her gather their documents while scanning the dispersing crowd for signs of additional threats. "We need to warn everyone in Millbrook and make sure they're prepared for whatever comes next." The journey back to Millbrook took 4 hours by wagon, but it felt like days as James and Martha raced against time and whatever scheme Harmon had prepared as his final gambit. Timothy rode with them, his excitement about the legal victory gradually giving way to concern as he picked up on the adults' tension. Daniel and Rosa followed in a second wagon with other Millbrook residents who'd attended the trial, their own celebration muted by growing awareness that something wasn't right. They smelled the smoke before they saw the town. A black column rose from Millbrook Center like a funeral pyre, visible from miles away across the flat Nebraska landscape. James felt his stomach drop as he recognized the distinctive smell of burning buildings mixed with something else. Something that reminded him of battlefields where explosions had torn through supply wagons filled with gunpowder and ammunition. "Dear God," Martha breathed, her hands clutching the wagon's side rail as they crested the final hill. "They're burning down the whole town." But it wasn't the whole town, it was something worse. The fire was concentrated on the church that had served as temporary housing for the inn's displaced residents, along with Mrs. Henderson's house, where several people had been staying since the original fire. The flames were too large and too organized to be accidental, and James could see figures moving deliberately around the burning structures with the systematic precision of people following a carefully prepared plan. "They waited until we were gone," James realized with growing horror. "They knew we'd all be in Omaha for the court decision, so they attacked the people who couldn't defend themselves." Timothy pointed toward the church with a shaking finger. "Mr. Crawford, look. There are people trapped inside." Through the smoke and flames, James could see faces at the church windows. Elderly parishioners who'd been attending a morning service when the fire started, along with several of the inn's former residents who'd been using the building as shelter. The main doors appeared to be blocked by debris that hadn't been there by accident, and the windows were too high for most people to escape through without help. James jumped from the moving wagon before Martha could stop him, his military training taking over as he assessed the tactical situation with deadly focus. The arsonists, he could see at least 6 men working to spread the fire and prevent rescue efforts, were positioned to control access to both burning buildings. They weren't just destroying property. They were willing to commit murder to achieve their goals. "Daniel," James shouted to the approaching second wagon, "bring every able-bodied man and anything that can break down doors or reach those windows. Rosa, get the women and children to safety behind the general store where they can't be seen." Martha refused to retreat to safety, instead grabbing buckets from the nearest well and organizing a bucket brigade among the townspeople who were emerging from buildings throughout Millbrook. Her medical condition was forgotten in the face of immediate crisis, her hands steady as she directed water toward the church's foundation in an attempt to slow the fire's advance. James reached the church first, dodging burning debris that crashed from the roof as the structure began to weaken under the fire's assault. The main doors were indeed blocked. Someone had piled heavy furniture against them from the outside and set it ablaze, creating a barrier that would take precious time to clear. He could hear voices from inside calling for help, including the distinctive sound of children crying in terror. One of the arsonists emerged from behind the burning debris, a heavy club in his hands and violence written across his features. James recognized him as one of the men who'd accompanied Harmon during his previous visits to the inn, and the recognition was apparently mutual. The man swung his weapon with deadly intent, but James's military reflexes allowed him to dodge the blow and counter with his good arm, catching his attacker in the solar plexus and dropping him to the ground. "The windows!" Martha shouted from across the square, pointing toward the church's side wall, where Daniel Jameson was attempting to position a ladder despite his arthritis. "We can get them out through the windows if we can reach them." More of Harmon's hired men appeared as the rescue efforts intensified, clearly under orders to prevent anyone from escaping the burning buildings alive. But they hadn't counted on the response from Millbrook's residents, who emerged from their homes armed with farm tools, hunting rifles, and the kind of righteous anger that came from watching their neighbors being murdered for corporate profit. Dr. Morrison arrived with his medical bag and immediately began treating people for smoke inhalation as they were pulled from the burning church. Mrs. Henderson, despite her own house being consumed by flames, organized the women into teams that provided water, bandages, and comfort to the wounded. Even the children contributed, with Timothy O'Brien running messages between different groups and helping guide elderly evacuees to safety. The battle for Millbrook raged for nearly an hour, with firefighting and actual fighting happening simultaneously as the community defended itself against both natural disaster and human evil. James found himself coordinating the defense with Daniel Jameson, their military experience, creating an effective command structure that maximized their limited resources against superior numbers of attackers. "James!" Martha's voice cut through the chaos with urgent alarm. "Edgar Harmon just arrived with more men. They're surrounding the square." James looked up from helping an elderly woman through a church window to see Harmon himself riding into the town square with a dozen armed riders, their faces showing the brutal determination of men who'd been ordered to finish a job, regardless of the cost. The local sheriff was notably absent, suggesting that Harmon's influence had reached deep enough into territorial politics to ensure official interference wouldn't complicate his plans. "People of Millbrook?" Harmon shouted over the crackling flames, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "This destruction could have been avoided if you'd been reasonable about progress and development. Surrender James Crawford and Martha Sinclair, and the rest of you will be allowed to leave town safely." The demand hung in the smoke-filled air like a death sentence. James understood that Harmon intended to eliminate the leadership that had organized resistance to his plans, probably making their deaths look like accidents in the fire that was still consuming buildings around the square. With them gone, the railroad could claim the land without further legal challenges and rebuild according to their corporate vision. "What do you say, Millbrook?" James called out to the assembled townspeople, his voice carrying across the square despite the fire's roar. "Do we negotiate with men who burn down churches and threaten children?" The answer came not in words but in actions, as every able-bodied resident of Millbrook stepped forward to form a protective circle around James and Martha. Farm tools became weapons, kitchen knives became daggers, and ordinary people became warriors, defending their community against those who would destroy it for profit. Even Timothy O'Brien picked up a heavy stick and took his place in the line, his young face set with determination that belonged to someone much older. Harmon's confident expression began to waver as he realized that his intimidation tactics had backfired spectacularly. Instead of dividing the community, his attacks had united them in ways that would make them infinitely more dangerous to his future plans. The simple property dispute had evolved into something resembling a war between two completely different visions of what America should become. "This isn't over," Harmon warned, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "The territorial government will hear about this rebellion, and there will be consequences for defying legitimate authority." "Let them come," Daniel Jameson replied, his arthritic hands steady on the rifle he'd carried home from the war. "We've faced worse than corrupt politicians and hired thugs, and we're still here." As Harmon and his men retreated, leaving behind the smoking ruins of buildings and the stronger bonds of a community that had been tested by fire and found itself unbreakable, James realized that they'd won something more important than a legal victory. They'd proven that ordinary people could stand against extraordinary power when they chose to value each other more than their own safety. The battle for Millbrook was over, but the war for what kind of society they wanted to build was just beginning. 6 months later, the sound of hammers and saws filled the Nebraska air as the new Sinclair Inn rose from the ashes of the old, its walls stronger and its purpose clearer than ever before. James Crawford stood in the doorway of what would soon be the main dining room, watching Martha Sinclair direct the placement of windows with the same determined efficiency that had carried her through every crisis they'd faced together. The building taking shape around them was larger than the original inn, designed to accommodate not just the people who'd lost homes in Harmon's final attack, but the growing number of families who'd heard about Millbrook's successful resistance and wanted to be part of a community that valued courage over conformity. The territorial government's investigation into the fires had resulted in Harmon's arrest and the railroad company's withdrawal from their aggressive land acquisition program, creating space for organic growth rather than corporate development. "Timothy, careful with that hammer," Martha called out as the now 13-year-old boy helped install trim around the new library's windows. His reading skills had improved so dramatically that he'd become the inn's unofficial librarian, organizing donated books and helping younger children discover the magic of stories. "We want those windows to actually stay in place when we're finished." Timothy grinned and adjusted his grip on the tool, his confidence with both words and woodworking, a testament to what people could accomplish when given genuine opportunities rather than charitable condescension. "Yes, ma'am, Miss Martha. Mr. Crawford showed me the right way to hold it so I don't bend the nails." James smiled at the exchange, remembering his own struggles with learning to use tools effectively with only one hand. The process of rebuilding had taught him that limitations could be overcome through patience, creativity, and the willingness to accept help from others without sacrificing dignity. More importantly, it had shown him that teaching skills to people like Timothy created a legacy that extended far beyond any individual accomplishment. Daniel Jameson emerged from the new garden area, his arthritis still troublesome but his spirits higher than they'd been since before the war. The expanded garden would provide food for the inn while also serving as a training ground where people could learn agricultural skills that would serve them throughout their lives. Several families had already approached him about establishing their own farms in the area, drawn by the combination of fertile soil and accepting community. "James, Martha," Daniel called out, wiping dirt from his hands with obvious satisfaction. "Come see what we've accomplished back here. I think you're going to be amazed at how much food we'll be able to produce." The garden tour revealed careful planning that maximized both productivity and beauty, with vegetable plots arranged around flowering plants that would attract beneficial insects while providing color throughout the growing season. Rosa Valdez had contributed her knowledge of herbs and spices that would enhance both cooking and basic medical care, creating a practical paradise that served multiple purposes simultaneously. "This is incredible," Martha said, her voice filled with wonder as she surveyed the organized abundance that surrounded them. "Daniel, you've created something that will feed bodies and souls for years to come." "We've created it," Daniel corrected gently. "Every person who's contributed labor, ideas, or encouragement has made this possible. That's what makes it special. It belongs to all of us, because all of us helped build it." Dr. Morrison approached from the direction of the main road, his medical bag replaced by surveying equipment as he worked to establish the boundaries for Millbrook's official expansion. The town had grown from a struggling frontier settlement into a thriving community that attracted people specifically because of its reputation for welcoming those who needed second chances. His own transformation from reluctant participant to enthusiastic supporter illustrated how involvement in meaningful work could change people's perspectives about their neighbors and themselves. "Martha, James," Dr. Morrison announced with obvious excitement, "the territorial government has approved our petition for incorporation. Millbrook is now officially a town with the legal authority to govern itself and protect its residents from outside interference." The news sparked celebration throughout the construction site, as workers paused in their activities to absorb the significance of achieving legal recognition for their community. Mrs. Henderson, who'd become the unofficial mayor after her house was rebuilt larger than before to accommodate town meetings, emerged from the inn's kitchen, carrying a tray of fresh bread that filled the air with the scent of home and permanence. "This calls for a proper feast," she announced, her earlier skepticism about Martha's strays completely replaced by pride in what they'd accomplished together. Rosa and I have been planning a celebration dinner for when the incorporation papers arrived, and today seems like the perfect time. As evening approached, the entire community gathered in the inn's new dining room for a meal that represented far more than simple nourishment. The long tables brought together people whose paths might never have crossed under different circumstances. Former soldiers and immigrants, elderly residents and young families, people who'd been born in Nebraska, and others who'd traveled thousands of miles to find a place where they belonged. James found himself seated between Martha and Timothy, surrounded by conversations that ranged from practical discussions about crop rotation to philosophical debates about the relationship between individual freedom and community responsibility. The boy who'd once struggled to read simple sentences now participated confidently in adult discussions, his questions revealing a mind that had been awakened to possibilities he'd never imagined. "Mr. Crawford," Timothy said during a brief lull in the conversation, "do you ever think about what would have happened if Miss Martha hadn't offered you that job at the original inn?" James considered the question seriously, looking around the room at faces that had become essential to his understanding of what family meant. "I think I would have spent the rest of my life believing that losing my arm in the war meant losing everything that made me valuable. Instead, I learned that worth comes from what you choose to do with whatever pieces of yourself remain intact." Martha's hand found his beneath the table, her fingers steady and warm as they intertwined with his own. The trembling that had once been a source of shame for her had become simply another characteristic that made her uniquely herself, no more significant than the color of her eyes or the sound of her laugh. Her condition continued to progress slowly, but she discovered that love and purpose provided strength that transcended physical limitations. "I have an announcement to make," Martha said, rising from her chair with a radiance that made every conversation in the room fade to silence. "James and I have decided to make our partnership official in every sense. We're planning to be married next month, and all of you are invited to witness the ceremony." The room erupted in cheers and applause as people surrounded them with congratulations and offers to help with wedding preparations. But James noticed that the celebration was about more than just two people choosing to spend their lives together. It was about the community recognizing that love could flourish in places where society had predicted only failure and disappointment. Rosa immediately began planning a wedding feast that would showcase every culinary skill she'd developed over years of feeding people who appreciated good food after going without for too long. Daniel offered to design flower arrangements using blooms from his garden, while Mrs. Henderson volunteered her house for the ceremony itself, since it was the largest indoor space in town. Even the children contributed ideas, with Timothy suggesting that the couple exchange vows using the original strongbox that Martha had saved from the fire, as a symbol of their commitment to protecting what they'd built together. As the celebration continued into the evening, James stepped outside onto the inn's new front porch to look up at stars that seemed brighter than he remembered from his childhood. The Nebraska Territory stretched endlessly in every direction, no longer representing isolation and limitation, but rather infinite possibility for people brave enough to define their own worth rather than accepting society's judgments. Martha joined him in the starlight, her presence making the vastness feel intimate rather than overwhelming. "Any regrets about how your life turned out?" she asked, settling beside him on the porch swing they'd installed that afternoon. "Only one," James replied, wrapping his good arm around her shoulders as she leaned against him with complete trust. "I regret that it took me so long to understand that being broken doesn't mean being worthless. It just means you have opportunities to rebuild yourself into something stronger than you were before." Inside the inn, Timothy's voice could be heard reading aloud to a group of younger children, his confident tone carrying across the night air as he shared stories of adventure and possibility. Daniel and Rosa were planning the next day's work in the garden, while Mrs. Henderson and Dr. Morrison discussed improvements to the town's infrastructure that would accommodate continued growth. "Look what we've built," Martha said softly, gesturing toward the warm light spilling from the inn's windows and the sounds of people who'd found their place in the world. Not just the building, but everything it represents. Proof that damaged people can create something beautiful when they're given the chance to try. James pulled her closer, feeling the steady rhythm of her breathing and the strength that radiated from her small frame. "Martha Sinclair, You saved my life in every way that matters. You took a broken soldier who thought he was worthless and showed him that the best parts of himself had survived the war intact. We saved each other, Martha corrected, her voice carrying the wisdom that came from understanding how healing worked. And now we get to spend the rest of our lives helping other people discover that their scars don't define their possibilities. The Nebraska Territory wind carried the scent of growing things and the promise of tomorrow across the prairie as James and Martha sat together on their porch, surrounded by a community that had chosen love over fear, inclusion over exclusion, and hope over despair. They'd proven that worth isn't determined by what you've lost, but by what you choose to build with whatever remains. And in the end, that was a lesson worth sharing with anyone brave enough to believe in second chances and the transformative power of authentic human connection. The future stretched before them like an unwritten story, full of challenges that would test their strength and victories that would justify their faith in each other. But whatever came next, they would face it together. Two people who discovered that the most beautiful things in life often emerge from the most broken places. If you're willing to do the patient work of rebuilding with love as your foundation,